Well, good morning, everybody, and a special welcome to those of you streaming with us live over the internet. Well, have you ever heard this expression, silence is golden? What does that mean? Sometimes the best thing to do is just keep your mouth shut. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of you start talking sometimes, you're like, oh no, I'm saying that? Usually connected with, when's your baby due? That's not worth the risk pretty much ever, I've decided. Kids, listen, this gets you in trouble. Like sometimes when things are not going your way, the best bet is just to stay quiet. I know it's hard to resist just taking that last parting shot, though, It's like, straighten up your room. I don't want to. Do it. Okay. Hitler! It just causes trouble. Silence is golden. Sometimes the best thing to do is just to not say it. You've heard this proverb, even a fool is thought wise if he holds his tongue. I knew a guy 25 years or so ago who got invited by Saddam Hussein to visit Saddam Hussein's rebuilt Babylon at a conference on ethnic musicology. The twist was this guy knew nothing about ethnic musicology, but he really wanted to go, so he decided to fake it. And he said he made it through this whole academic conference just by being quiet and just being contemplative looking. Sometimes you can just hold your tongue and get through. Well, listen, we are just about done with this major section in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 13, and 14. There's one little chunk left for us to deal with, chapter 14, verses 34 to 35. And in these two notorious verses, Paul seems to be telling the women in the church of Corinth that they are not allowed to talk in church. Silence is golden, Paul seems to be saying. Well, is it? Is that golden for us to read where we are sitting here today in the 21st century? How are we to wrestle with this? Because it's a problem for us, guys. Because if you look this up online, you're going to come across images like this. Look on the screen. Here's the text there, a compilation of Bible passages. It is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Wives should regard their husbands as they regard their Lord. Women are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate. If there's anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Or how about this guy? Look what he wrote on the back of his truck. This is a guy in Virginia. It made the news. It was that notorious. My favorite part of that story is the guy's name is Tom Hick. That's pretty good. I'm surprised it's not West Virginia, but no, it's actually Virginia. But what do we do with this? Because there it sits in our text. How do we wrestle with a difficult passage like this that looks a very oppressive, demeaning statement to make in regard to women? Well, we'll focus in and wrestle with this passage today, and we'll divide our discussion into two parts. Part one, we'll first consider, is this even an authentic writing, an authentic command by Paul? There's plenty of people who will argue, no, this is not actually from the pen of Paul at all, but rather something added in by a scribe into the manuscript somewhere along the way. So we'll consider that possibility first. And then part two, we'll say, all right, let's assume this is from Paul. How can we think through it and wrestle through this and see what can be said about it from our perspective here today? So hopefully you grabbed a bulletin when you came in. If not, grab one from the back. There's an outline in there that'll be of some use to you, hopefully, as we consider this together. Okay, so here you go. First one, part one. Let's ask this. Silence is not authentic? And here we take up the question of whether these two verses even should be in there, if we should really believe that these came from the Apostle Paul. But first, let's look at the verses together. Look, here's the passage we're dealing with, verses 34 to 35. Look in your outline. Here's what Paul says. Seemingly, perhaps, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Now, what raises this first question of whether this is even authentically written by Paul or not is your first bullet point there under that point, and that is this. A few Greek manuscripts have these two verses after verse 30. So notice I've printed kind of the couple paragraphs there for you, and I've flagged the two places where these verses show up. So here's one such manuscript. Here's a picture of, it's called GA6. It is today in Paris. This manuscript is dated to about the 6th century. And here's our two verses in the red box. Okay, there's 14:34 to 35. And in this manuscript, they have been moved all the way to the end of chapter 14. Right below the red line, this is the beginning of chapter 15. That's very curious. All right, so let's try to figure out, should we view this as authentically from Paul or not? First of all, some reasons why we might believe these verses were not written by Paul, but were added later. So here's your next bullet points on your outline there. First one, it's difficult to explain how these verses ended up in two different places. Like a scribe in copying would have to move them. But why? Why move these? It's hard to come up with a good explanation why. Perhaps the most probable explanation is that this started off as a comment written in the margin of a manuscript. Sometimes this would be done to add some extra information, and the next scribe who came along saw that and didn't know precisely what that meant. And see, you would correct a manuscript. After a manuscript was copied, typically they would look over it, and if there are any corrections that need to be made, they would be marked. So the next scribe coming along could look at this comment in the margin and take this to be a correction that he's supposed to add in somewhere. Now the problem is, he might not know precisely where he's supposed to add it in. And so the same verses could be added in different places. Let me give you an example of this. So for a couple summers, I had the neat opportunity to go to Athens with a group called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and we were digitizing, taking digital photos of ancient New Testament manuscripts. Here's the library we were at, the National Library in Athens. I was partnered up with this guy, an Anglican priest with excellent taste in music named Paul. And so there we are, we were doing this together. So he'd run the computer, I'd hold the manuscripts. So one day we came across this very interesting manuscript. And I don't remember if this was Paul and I's or if it was one of the other team members, but look at this one. This is a page out of John chapter 7, the end of John chapter 7. And in that passage, typically we will find the story of the woman caught in adultery. Remember this famous story. Now, if you look at this passage in your Bibles, you will see it is marked or flagged or footnoted in some way. If you look at the new NIV, they have the whole thing bracketed off and it's all in italics. And they'll have some sort of comment which says, the oldest and best manuscripts of John do not have this story. And so the oldest manuscripts of John do not have the story of the woman caught in adultery. And what's so interesting is, if you look at different manuscripts, this story shows up in different places in John. One group of manuscripts even adds it into the Gospel of Luke. And so what that shows is, this is a floating text, it's called. And what this shows is that likely this was not original to John's Gospel. It was probably probably authentic memory or tradition about Jesus, and it probably got written in the margin at some time. So anyway, which brings us to this picture. This is very interesting. This is not very common. So look what we have in this manuscript. We have the main text of the Gospel of John there in the middle, but notice on the right page, this particular scribe has written the story of the woman caught in adultery out in the margin. Now what's he saying by that? What's he acknowledging? He's acknowledging there's something fishy about that. He realized there's some kind of secondary status to this passage, he realized, and so this particular scribe wrote it in the margin. So very plausibly, what happened to a floating text like this story is it probably got written in the margin of a manuscript by a helpful scribe. The next scribe came along and said, what are we supposed to do with this? Another guy's like, I don't know, let's put it in somewhere. And scribes pick different places to put it in. So this could explain what is going on with our passage in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. This could be a common explanation of why we have this dislocation of verses. Look at your next bullet point there. Another reason why we might not say this is authentic to Paul. If the verses are removed, the passage reads more smoothly and wraps up the discussion of the Spirit and gifts without digressing to the very specific issue of women. Like in this whole passage, Paul's been very general, dealing with everybody, and if we remove these two verses, it reads very smoothly and avoids what appears like a digression. When Paul has given instructions to women earlier in the letter, he's also balanced that with parallel instructions to men. So there's been a balance, and this doesn't feel like that. This one's even more serious. Look at the next bullet point. The content of the verses seems to contradict what Paul himself has written about women praying and prophesying back in chapter 11, and what Paul writes about how all can prophesy in 14:31. Here's one of the biggest objections to seeing this is actually written by Paul. You may remember, if you've been around here, back in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians, Paul got involved with a discussion with the women in Corinth on the issue of wearing head coverings. First century Corinth, something a modest, respectable woman did. In public, you wear some kind of head covering over your hair. And so apparently what was going on in the Corinthian church was women were participating, helping lead worship, giving prophecies, and praying in the public worship service without their hair covered, without their heads covered. And so Paul writes instructions on that. But clearly what he assumes in chapter 11 is that women can appropriately take part in the worship service, speaking in terms of prophecy and prayer. So this seems to flatly contradict what Paul says here in chapter 14, which raises more question marks. Like, how could Paul say that back then in chapter 11 and say this here in chapter 14? I was going to show you. Look at the screen. Here's the verses in question back in chapter 11. Paul said, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It's the same as if her having her head shaved. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Notice the issue is not whether or not she can make noise in the worship service, right? Okay, last bullet point there. Paul appealing to the law. So look at the verse. Look at verse 34, our first of our two verses in question. Paul says women should remain silent in the churches. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. That sounds very strange on Paul's lips. Paul is notorious and famous for teaching that Christians are not under the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law. Now, it's true sometimes, commonly in fact, Paul will appeal to aspects of the Old Testament law to guide Christian behavior. But when he does so, he always highlights a verse. He always points to a specific verse. Nowhere does he just say like this, well, the law says. And to make it even worse, guess what? There's no place in the Old Testament law where it actually says this. Paul, what in the world? Well, maybe it's not Paul, right? That's part of the point. So you can see why a great many people will argue 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35 is not written by Paul, but it's added in the margin by a well-meaning scribe somewhere along the line, or maybe not so well-meaning scribe, and gets worked its way into the text in one or two different places. Okay, well, on the other hand, what are some reasons why we might view this as actually being written by Paul? First one, notice, no manuscript lacks these verses, which is very significant. It's true, a couple verses have them moved to a different place, but we have no manuscript of 1 Corinthians that doesn't have these verses. And that's actually very different from a passage like the story of the woman caught in adultery. Because there we have a passage that moves around in different manuscripts, but we also have manuscripts that don't have it. That's different. So we don't have any text of 1 Corinthians that doesn't have these verses. So that's significant. Second, most manuscripts, including the oldest and best ones, have these verses in the normal place after verse 33. So the vast majority of manuscripts have them in the normal place. Third bullet point, it's possible that Paul himself wrote these verses in the margin of the letter, and a later scribe included them in different places. You would read over a letter before you sent it out, and it's very possible to imagine Paul looking over the letter, and for whatever reason, he's aware of some issue, and he writes this in the margin himself, and maybe puts his signature on it, so the next scribe knows it's from him. Well, bounce that letter down the road, someone's going to copy it, they want to add that into the main text, not sure where, and it goes to one of two different places. Like, we could easily see that happen. So, what's the verdict on this? How should we think about these two verses? It's very tempting to just say, well, not written by Paul, added in by some scribe later, and then we neatly dodge the whole problem. Very tempting. But on the other hand, the fact that all manuscripts have this suggests to me probably the safer thing to do is, okay, let's assume it's written by Paul and wrestle with it accordingly and see what sense we can make of it, okay? So we'll wrap up part one with that and say, all right, let's just for the sake of argument go with this being written by the Apostle Paul, and let's say, hey, in the margin, and add it in for that reason in two different places. So let's go to our next question on your outline. Part two, we'll wrestle with a different question. It's this: silence is culturally limited? So now the question is something like this said to all Christians at all time, or is this something we should understand to be inexorably bound up with first century cultural issues in a place like Corinth? So let's walk through the passage together. Look at verse 34. Paul says women should remain silent in the churches. think the first thing to notice, in this passage that we've been going through, Paul has already given instructions to different groups to be quiet at different times. So look on the screen. This is verse 28. If there is no interpreter, Paul says, speaking of speaking in tongues, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. So already Paul has used the same word, same terminology to tell some Christians in the worship service sometimes to stay quiet. Verse 29, 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. If a revelation comes to someone who's sitting down, the first speaker should stop. Again, for the sake of harmony and working together well, Paul says to some, okay, you need to be quiet sometimes. So this would fit that theme. But now Paul turns to women. Why? Well, knowing what we know about the Corinthians, and knowing what we know about the back and forth between Paul and the Corinthians, odds are there's something going on that's provoking this. There's some particular issue going on, just like the hair covering issue, that has brought this issue up. And the thing is, Paul clearly knows about it, and the Corinthians clearly know about it. What's our problem? We don't necessarily know quite what's going on. We're listening to half the phone conversation in this instance, as it seems. So the struggle is to figure out, okay, what precisely might have been going on in Corinth that causes Paul to say this. Notice that he goes on to say, they are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission as the law says. Now, I think the reason we know there is some more specific issue going on here is precisely because of what Paul said back in chapter 11, where he freely allows women to prophesy and to pray publicly in the worship service. That tells us whatever Paul is dealing with here, he cannot be talking about the issue of women speaking in church absolutely. There's something more specific he's zeroing in on here, surely. So what's provoking it? Notice, it says they must be in submission as the law says. So submission was a virtue in the ancient world for a woman. You were expected and in fact legally bound to submit to your father, and then I don't want to say ownership, that's the wrong term, but not far from it in the ancient world, that authority would be transferred to your husband, and the virtue was you were to be submissive to your husband and in fact legally obligated to. So this is part of, in the ancient culture, what is expected for a good and honorable woman, to be submissive to her husband. Now look, if this is part and parcel with what is considered good ethics in the culture, would we expect the Christians to come along and upturn that and to cancel that? Probably not. We would expect them to continue to uphold something like that would be considered virtuous. Now, Paul recognizes, I think, clearly there is an essential equality between men and women. He says as much in passages like Galatians, where he says, in Christ there's neither Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. So he understands there's essential equality. Okay? We see the same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he deals with sexuality and marriage, where really counterculturally, progressively, Paul deals with the issue completely in balance and completely equal. And yet Paul does continue and endorse this ethic of a wife being submissive to her husband. For example, in Ephesians 5, right? But right before in that passage, Paul tells the women to submit to their husbands, he says something interesting. He says, to intro the whole section, submit to one another. So my own personal view on this is that Paul is okay extending the command for wives to submit to their husbands because he sees it as sitting under the larger umbrella given to all Christians to submit to one another. So we're to be submissive to one another, gracious and humble. One subcategory of that would be wives submitting to their husbands. And I would say sometimes husbands should submit to their wives because this is under the larger overarching umbrella of submit one to the other. Just like Paul says right after that, husbands, love your wives. Now, Paul can say to the husband, love your wives, I think, specifically, in part because there is an overarching command for all Christians to love one another. So are women, wives, obligated to love their husbands as well? Absolutely. So, in my view, there should be an essential equality here and cooperativeness in that sense, but I digress a little bit. What occupation, what role does Paul fill? What is he? Tent maker. Okay, that's true. That's his actual profession, his career. Let me rephrase that. I'm thinking in terms of category of Christian ministry now. What is Paul? Apostle. Yes, And if we think about what an apostle is doing, what maybe more common category of full-time Christian ministry would we peg him as? What's he doing? He is a missionary or an evangelist, right? So we got to bear in mind, this is Paul the missionary. Paul the missionary is very concerned with how the surrounding city of Corinth is going to view this little church. Now, Paul is okay at some level if it hits a central issue and an issue of idolatry, going against the culture and making enemies. But if it's negotiable, Paul would much rather have the Corinthian church avoid causing offense, doing their best to fit in, doing their best to be honorable and respectful citizens. So drop down to verse 35 in the passage. It is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. That is the language of social judgment. So this is part of the culture in the first century. Women were very restricted in terms of what was understood to be appropriate in a public setting. In your home, you could be more free to take authority and speak out and do things. But in a public setting, you were more hindered. So just like in chapter 11, Paul says to the women, I want you to wear head coverings, so when you're up front, you're not acting in that culture in a way that looks sexually provocative. I think what Paul is saying here to the women in Corinth is, I don't want you in the worship service to be acting in a way that would be socially provocative in the eyes of what is considered acceptable in first century culture. Going back, look, Paul says they must be in submission as the law says. Again, this is absolutely a virtue in the ancient world, and it's absolutely a virtue in the Jewish world. So look what the first century Jewish non-Christian Josephus writes along these lines on the screen. Talking of the Old Testament, the Scriptures, Josephus says, it commands us also when we marry not to have regard to portion, nor to take a woman by violence, nor to persuade her deceitfully and knavishly, great word by the way, knavishly, kids, use it, it's excellent, but to demand her in marriage of him who has power to dispose of her and is fit to give her away by the nearness of his kindred, or, look now, as says the Scripture, a woman is inferior to her husband in all things. Now, what's so fascinating, just like our verse, guess what? It doesn't say that anywhere in the Old Testament. That's not in the Scriptures. And even the translator of Josephus puts a footnote here and says this text is nowhere in our present copies of the Old Testament. So interestingly, we see Josephus punting to this sort of larger category, just like we see Paul doing here. Now, to be fair to Josephus, if we look at the Old Testament as an ancient document, is it fair to say that the Old Testament continues, supports, and sustains the common universal ethic back then for a wife to be submissive to her husband? Is that fair to say? Absolutely. So at some level, Josephus and Paul are simply perhaps looking at the Old Testament just saying, look, absolutely, overall, this is what we see in the Old Testament. This is the conduct of godly people in the Old Testament. Now, the NIV translation is giving us a little hint of what they think is going on here. So look at the text on your outline, and look at what verse is it. I don't know, whatever the verse is, it says law. Notice that word law. Is it capitalized or lowercase? Lowercase, right? Now, interestingly, the NIV, when they're translating, if they think a writer is talking about the Old Testament law of Moses, they will put it in capital letters. So their suggestion is that actually Paul's not even pointing at the Old Testament law specifically, which helps us because, again, there is no place where it exactly says this. And as astute as Paul is, we would expect him to point to the passage if he had one in mind. This could also just have the sense of the law, like lay of the land. Like this is the law of the land. This is what people do. And remember, in the Greco-Roman world, by law, pretty much, a woman had to be submissive to her husband. So Paul might not even be pointing to the Old Testament. He might just be saying, look, as the law says, as everybody does, Roman law, Greek law, biblical law, this is the way it was. Okay, but we still haven't tried to reason out precisely what is going on, what is precisely provoking this. Look at verse 35. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. There's perhaps a clue. If the solution is to go home and ask their husband, what perhaps is causing it? How does that point us into figuring out what has actually been going on in the Corinthian church. Two main suggestions. Here's the first one. One is that the women in Corinth were asking questions within the worship service in a way that was being interruptive, and perhaps in a way that was showing a lack of education. Ladies, in the ancient world, are you generally more educated or less educated than your husbands? Less, right? Women received typically far less education. Women were typically much younger than their husbands. And the ancient world took a dim view of questions. Like sometimes it was okay, but if there was teaching going on, it was not considered the right thing to do to interrupt with a bunch of questions. So let me show you a passage here. This is the ancient writer Plutarch, non-Christian, just describing this sort of phenomena. Look on the screen. He says, "But those who instantly interrupt with contradictions, neither hearing nor being heard, but talking while others talk, behave in an unseemly manner, whereas the man who has the habit of listening with restraint and respect takes in and masters a useful discourse, and more readily sees through and detects a useless or a false one, showing himself thus to be a lover of truth, and not a lover of disputation, nor forward and contentious." Look what he goes on to say about uneducated questions. "For when they are by themselves, they are not willing to give themselves any trouble, but they give trouble to the speaker by repeatedly asking questions about the same things, like unfledged nestlings," baby birds. Ooh, static. "Always agape towards the mouth of another and desirous of receiving everything already prepared and predigested." So it appears that if we take this line of interpretation, there is some sort of behavior on the part of the women that is being interruptive of the worship service in the asking of questions, perhaps uneducated questions. Now, one of the things that has probably contributed to the confusion for the women, same as back in the head covering issue, it has to do with the issue of public and private space. Where are the ancient churches meeting in the first century in Corinth? In where? People's homes. And so notice, for the women in the church, there might have been easy to misconstrue the setting here. So a woman in the first century in her own home could act with more authority, speak more freely. And so it would be very easy to slip into more that manner of acting at home. But Paul, in essence, would be saying, ladies, when the church is assembled, even though it's in a home, maybe even in your home, nonetheless, let's bear in mind this is essentially becoming public space now as we're inviting unbelievers and outsiders to come in and join. So again, this is Paul the missionary, I think, wanting to put the best foot forward. Now, when Paul says they should ask their own husbands at home, that sounds super insulting, right? Super demeaning. But Paul surely doesn't intend it that way. And in fact, this is probably a bit progressive of Paul. Why? What is Paul actually wanting for the women? Knowledge. He actually wants them to learn. That is not necessarily a given, guys, in the ancient world. So we do see, in fact, Paul here is desirous for the Christian women to learn and understand. So look what Plutarch again writes on the subject of philosophy, how a husband should instruct his wife in philosophy. "As for your wife, you must collect from every source what is useful, as do the bees, and carrying it within your own self, impart it to her, and then discuss it with her, and make the best of these doctrines, her favorite and familiar themes." Plutarch says a true student of philosophy should learn it and then take it home and instruct his wife so that she too can share in these things. So Paul wants the women to learn, but whatever is going on in the worship service as it's happening is at some level dysfunctional. And Paul says, no, the more appropriate setting for this to take place will be in your home. Okay, so that's one suggestion in terms of what's going on here. Interrupting with questions. Well, there's another possibility. Notice what Paul just finished saying in verse 29. Look at verse 29. 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. Does Paul expect you to believe whatever a prophet says just because he says it? What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to test it. Now, what if you hear someone in the Corinthian church stand up and give a prophecy? God says, it's okay for us to marry 3 people now. If you hear that, and you're supposed to test every prophecy, what should you do? You should speak up. Say, wait a minute, that is not true. Now, what's potentially going on in the church in Corinth? Look again at verse 35. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home. Look at that word, inquire. It's actually a slightly strong word in Greek for question. Now, it can be used of normal questions. Like, it's a common word to use for questions. But it's also an intensive form, okay? Sometimes it's used for more in the sense of interrogation. This is the term that's used describing Jesus being grilled by Pontius Pilate or the high priest, one of those two. And so the other possibility that many suggest of what's going on here is that women in the church of Corinth are participating in the testing and challenging and contradiction of prophecies. Okay, that may be very fine and appropriate. But what happens if her husband is the one that gave that prophecy? Now, for us today, okay, no big deal necessarily. In first century public setting for a wife to speak up and contradict her husband, is that good, socially speaking, in the first century or bad? Bad. That would be scandalous in the first century. And so this could as well be the sort of dynamic of what's going on that Paul is resisting and telling them to do differently. So two different possible ways to understand what precisely is provoking the situation. But my view is, I think it's fair to say that this looks like it belongs to that category of passages in the Bible that seem inexorably bound up with the first century culture. Okay, just like we saw back in chapter 11 with the head coverings. Like, looking around, ladies, I see no women wearing head coverings, right? And rightly so, I think, because clearly that was part and parcel to the dynamics and the social setting of the first century. So too, I think, for us here. Now, if you and I are missionaries, and we're trying to start a church in a conservative village in the Middle East, might we, in fact, wish to continue something like this almost exactly as Paul wrote it? Perhaps. Because if we found ourselves in a culture where these are the values, it would be wise for us to accommodate to those values, as long as it is no compromise of the gospel. So I think this is what we have going on here. It's Paul the missionary, I think. So fast forward to our day. So if we were to take this very literally and apply it and say, okay, this is the way it is, women cannot talk in church, cannot participate, cannot pray up front, etc., 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 what would Paul the missionary say? If we were to do that, how would that make our church look in the eyes of our culture, good or bad? So interestingly, following this advice would in fact have the exact opposite of Paul's intended effect when he said it to the first church in Corinth there. And so I suspect if Paul the missionary was in our culture, he'd look around and he would flip-flop 100% on this issue. I think for Paul, this belonged to the secondary, non-central areas and practice of Christianity where there can be fluidity and flexibility. So the challenge for us when we find something like this that is, we'd say is at some level culturally conditioned, is like, okay, what is a principle then we can extract from it that could apply to any culture? We can look at how Paul addressed the original culture, try to come up with some sort of principle that could then apply to any culture. So here's my attempt. We'll put it this way. Bottom line. Pursue Christian growth with respectful conduct toward all. Pursue Christian growth. Why would I say that based on what Paul says here? Because what does he encourage the women to do? It's not the way we'd expect. It's not the way we'd do it. But he is encouraging the women to learn, which again is not necessarily a given in the first century. Why would I say with respectful conduct toward all? Because Paul has his radar up to public perception. He wants the Christians to, as often as possible, look honorable, faithful, exemplary. Now, this is the Paul who gets himself executed by the government. So there is a line for Paul, right? And he is willing to make enemies over issue of truth eventually. But this is also the guy who says, to those under the law, I live like under the law. To those not under the law, I live like not under the law. And Paul got pinned to the carpet by his enemies for being a flip-flopper. And at some level, it was true, because on certain issues, he was freely able to, like a cuttlefish, adapt himself to his background. So 3 suggestions. First, by interpreting difficult passages like this with cultural sensitivity. The Bible's not a newspaper. At some level, we have to think through the grid of, okay, what was going on in the first century for a passage like this, or even further back in time when we read Old Testament passages. And the goal is to figure out, okay, what is timeless here at a level of principle, it applies at all time, versus what belonged to the particularity of that moment in time. Which is not always easy to figure out where that line is, by the way. Right? Because you could just wave the magic wand of, oh, it's cultural, and just do away with anything you don't like in the Bible. So we don't want to do that either. Second, by recognizing the value Paul places on spiritual growth for everyone. Again, we already said that. Let her learn. Yes. And by the way, if you look at the back of your outline, that first paragraph quote I gave you on just how uneasily this passage sits, even in Paul's other writings. Look at the list of women in that passage that Paul acknowledges, greets, treats as co-workers all over the Mediterranean world. Paul clearly values the knowledge, the education, the participation in ministry of a whole bunch of women. So whatever he's saying here is not undoing all of that he says elsewhere. Third, by always being careful to model respectful behavior to the watching world as often as we can. Like, this is how we want to conduct ourselves. Paul the missionary would care what the reputation for Grace Bible Chapel is in Grand Rapids, or Assembly of God Church, or all of us together, right? Absolutely. Because one of the things that influence if a person decides to believe in Jesus is past experiences with Christians. So Paul the missionary wants us to consider this. Well, today we consider this challenging passage, 1 Corinthians 14, excuse me, let me try that again. Take it easy, microphone. Take it easy. Today we consider this challenging passage, 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35, kind of one of the sharpest pokes for us in terms of the Bible and how it can be viewed as very much oppressive and anti-women. So part one, we ask, first of all, if silence is not authentic. We wrestle with, okay, did this even come from Paul? And it's very possible it didn't. But the fact that we have it in all manuscripts of 1 Corinthians that have that passage leads me to say, okay, we should assume probably that it is written by Paul, even though it's certainly possible it's not. So part two then, we wondered if silence is culturally limited. Is what Paul says here limited in some sense to cultures like that? In my view, my argument would be yes, absolutely. And yet we looked for a principle in there that we could apply across the board to different settings. And we said this: pursue Christian growth with respectful conduct towards all. And here we see Paul's passion and desire, Paul the missionary, for the Christians to live godly, honorable, and winsome lives in their setting, in their world. Okay, so is silence golden? Well, it all depends on the circumstance and time, right? Silence was clearly golden in this sense at some level for the Corinthians in the first century. Silence for women like this in our culture right now in Grand Rapids, not so much, I would suggest. So back to this guy's truck, Tom Hicks. What's so interesting about this is this guy is not a Christian. He's an atheist. And he did this just to poke at us. So listen to what he says. His message is that the Bible is offensive. I want people to read the Bible. I want them to see this message and say that it's true, Hicks explained. It's a hateful, hateful piece of work, which Christians try to turn around and they talk about love. And look, let's be sympathetic. From where he's standing, that is absolutely how it looks, right? Just like if we considered the holy text of some other religion that made some claims that looked very much anti-women, we'd be like, it's ridiculous. And we just dismiss it out of hand. So I understand what he's saying, even though I don't understand why he would spray paint it on the back of his truck. That seemed to draw a lot of aggression to him, and it did. But I think in this case, he definitely misses the heart and the spirit of who Paul was and what Paul was saying in a passage like this. And hopefully we also will not make the same mistake.